Neverwinter Nights 2 was released on Halloween 2006 in North America. The game was a follow-up to the 2002 original and promised a massive update on the style, companions, combat, and gameplay of the original. But the game received poor reviews overall compared to the predecessor. Didn't reach the same level of sales or popular acclaim, and ultimately was the last in this aborted attempt at a series. BioWare would later reclaim success in the vastly more popular Dragon Age games, and Neverwinter would be left in the dust. Should this game be left in the dustbin of history, or is it a forgotten classic, unfairly maligned by the world, we need to shake off and put on the mantle of greatness? Or is it possible that the game manages to be both? Well, let's take a look. This is the second part of a two-part series about Neverwinter Nights. If you haven't seen the original, you can click here to check out that one, which you may want to do first before watching this one. Sadly, Neverwinter Nights 2 is a repeat of the sad situation of 1. In fact, scratch that, it's even worse. The story of Neverwinter Nights 2 was even more boring and dull as dishwater than the original. You begin in a chirpy little rural village as a young adult being trained as an adventurer. The village has no personality and feels horrible compared to the start of Dragon Age or the prison of Baldur's Gate 2, or the great intro of Planescape Torment in the Mortuary. Those games begin with something interesting about them. A unique, gripping introduction to a story and a stimulating location that drives interest in the world. I want to find out what the heck is going on in Guardian when my spaceship crash lands in a forest, and a bizarre woman in a hover speeder lands right next to me, in Wizardry 7. In Neverwinter Nights 2, there's really nothing, not a zip to start with, no pizzazz. It began in a stock medieval village with straight-from-central casting NPCs, and nothing compelling us into the story. They try to set up some kind of mystery, but it doesn't really work. We do see our village get attacked and some people are killed, but we as players don't have any affinity for these people or this time because we just started playing. Like in Neverwinter Nights 1, this might have been an acceptable start to a pen and paper D&D game, but video games have to compete with, I know this sounds crazy, other video games. Take Final Fantasy VI for example, when that amazing scene of robotic walkers on a snowy field sets the stage for mystery and excitement. Incredible. Or the terrorist attack at the beginning of FF7. It's cinematic and glorious. Some may object to comparing a Western and a Japanese RPG, but that's crazy. If the game wants to hold my interest in it, it has to compete with other entertainment media. A major rule when starting a D&D licensed game is to compare everything you're doing to other video games. Don't make your game a boring adventure module you'd play with friends to cut their teeth in a pen and paper game. After this awful start, the game never gets better. Your town is assaulted, and you make your way to the city of Neverwinter, passing through the same medieval fantasy version of Europe we've seen 1,000 times. Fighting bandits or lizard people, yawn-inducing stuff. The entire world is too bright and cheery, too electric green, and the buildings have no skill or worth in their design. I have to repeat my criticism of the first game by saying this takes place in a strange estuary of game design. After the heyday of PC RPGs with top-down views, but before graphical advances really allowed people to make excellent modern, fully realized 3D worlds. Any attempt before the mid-2000s, such as Daggerfall or Morrowind, I consider to be visual failures. But the Neverwinter Nights games didn't even attempt that. They were halfway between the top-down oldies and the three-dimensional newbies. Not good as one and not good as the other. Not retro, not modern. Anywho, you eventually reach the city of Neverwinter, and hoo boy, it looks like trash. Compared to the eerie, plague-ridden nighttime streets in the first game, the new city of Neverwinter is positively cheery and pleasant. What are we supposed to feel here? Calm? Happiness? Peace? Maybe I've become too used to grimdark games like Dark Souls, King's Field, or Diablo. But this is altogether happy and bubbly. It looks like a Disney movie interpretation of a city. The capital city of Ferelden in Dragon Age looked great by comparison. There was mud and squalor and some age to the buildings. It actually looked like it was set in, I don't know, the Middle Ages. Too many of the building interiors in this game look like pleasantly appointed Victorian homes, or nice little B&Bs you may go to on vacation in New England. The kingdom looks too fairy tale here. I can't get sucked into this world. I'm afraid the citizens are going to burst into song at any moment. It's here you discover the laughable bad guy of this game, and it's actually worse than Neverwinter 1. Yes, it's worse than the world being taken over by a lizard. It's... get ready for this. The King of Shadows! Dun dun dun! The King of Shadows? That sounds like something from an episode of Are You Afraid of the Dark? The King of Shadows, really? Is this D&D or a children's book for 6-year-olds? I was playing a D&D game in Dark Sun where you started out as a slave fighting to the death in gladiatorial pits for the glory of the Sorcerer King. I have never run into a worse and more pathetic foe for you to combat in a video game, especially one done by otherwise competent people. This game was designed by Jay Sawyer, the guy who helped make Fallout New Vegas one of the best games of the past decade. This storyline failed to evoke the tiniest shred of interest from me. I have no desire to fight this petty fight against a comically designed and named bad guy. The NPCs are almost all poor. I found nothing good about any of them. If you like them, I sympathize, that's fine, but I hated almost everyone. From the barely memorable dwarf who wants to be a monk or the stock paladin character, to Bishop the chaotic evil ranger who helps you for some sort of reason, to the fire mage who wants to burn everything down that's a little bit of a rip-off of Ignis except not even a quarter as good. I dearly wish I could have made my own collection of characters, but once again that's denied us in favor of these great specimens of fantasy writing. There's far more incidental dialogue that tries to make your NPCs more conversational, which is a good choice that I like. However, the characters weren't any good. I don't want to spend time with them and hear their stories like I would with Fall from Grace or someone like that. In a tragic design choice, you will spend a large amount of game time in Neverwinter Nights 2 building a castle and administering the surrounding lands as a noble. This has some precedent in old-fashioned AD&D. When you reached a certain level in that game, you could attract a retinue of warriors and gain lands and advance into the nobility, essentially. However, it's utterly out of place here in Neverwinter Nights 2. This is a video game that's an RPG, an action RPG, not this kind of game. So much of the base game has huge problems, it seems nuts to waste time in this irrelevant side area. A famous game designer, Sid Meier of the Civilization series, once said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "It's better to focus on one game than two games." What he was trying to say is that you shouldn't stuff too much into your game. It should just be one game, not two jammed together. He sometimes gets questioned about why he didn't add this or that feature to his game that people in the mod community maybe wanted to put in. And he didn't add it because it would have been too much, too distracting from the main experience. And this entire subplot of building a fortress and administering the land as a baron is weakly done for a strategy title, which this game isn't, and miserably extraneous for an RPG. It does nothing right, kind of like the graphics of this game. I felt much the same about the base building subplot in Fallout 4. Now don't get me wrong, it was done much better there than in Neverwinter Nights 2, but it felt like they should have worked out the kinks in the regular game. It all feels surreal. They didn't have someone there saying, hey, this is wrong about 95% of the game. The major part of the game, 95% of the game, has huge flaws in it that needed addressing. Some of them are so wretched they should have been scrapped and replaced, and yet the producers spent loads of precious time making something extra, an appendix to the main game that could easily have been excised without trouble. At its worst, it feels like they've added this merely to extend the runtime of a fairly short game. It's a ludicrous distraction from a game that badly needs help to begin with. The story drags you around the fairly tedious and predictable lands around Neverwinter, all of it boring until the final showdown with the King of Shadows. It's not a badly designed boss fight, and it takes the idea from Planescape Torment, later used in Dragon Age Origins, that your more devious evil characters can betray you and try to kill you if you're not careful. But the giant shadowy creature is not going to go down in the history of video game bosses anytime soon. Much of the reason this game fails to sell itself is not just the lame story, it's the visual design. The look, feel, and style of the game is, well, you've been seeing it throughout this review, and I'm going to get to it now. How could it get worse? How? How? Against all logic, the appearance of the second Neverwinter Nights game is worse than the original. The character and monster designs have the same ugly vagueness I talked about in Part 1. The faces for player characters, NPCs, and monsters are hideous. And the variety of monster design is, well, it's almost gone. Pretty much everything seems humanoid in some way or another. You can't really get any monstrous creatures here. This would have been unacceptable even in the late 90s, but this was 2006. 2006! The year of the Xbox 360 and PS3. Only a year before BioShock and Mass Effect would be released. And this garbage is the best they could do? The bleary vagueness of everything is back in full force. Nothing has any definition or power behind it. The textures on everything are woolly and soft, like an extremely low-resolution CRT TV. Even with the highest settings cranked up on a modern PC, it still looks awful. There's no richness or depth to the creatures. The buildings, nature, everything you look at is blurry. A distinct indistinctness, if that makes any sense, hovers over everything. The monster design is some of the worst I've ever seen. And definitely the worst in a game that's made by otherwise competent people. Look at this orc. Look at this lizardling. Look at that. This style of game design was absolutely not well thought out. Just look at a sample of these monsters and ask yourself, did they care?
You see, they just didn't care.
This frame is a clear indication that they just didn't care.
Folks, they just didn't care.
The monsters are wretchedly drawn. Is it the fault of the artists or the game engine? They're less sophisticated, no personality, very little variety, virtually everything a humanoid. Ugly, ugly, ugly. I would go into greater detail, but the game speaks for itself. Look how terrible it is. Just look. The art direction seems stuck between two generations, as I said before. 3 years after this, the first Dragon Age game was released, a magnificent third-person RPG that could be played top-down or in close-up, and it all looked great. But Neverwinter Nights seems to have more in common with the increasingly ancient Baldur's Gate or Fallout 2 style of top-down RPGs. The technology hadn't advanced to make it really 3D like Dragon Age, yet the late 90s style was not old enough to be considered retro. This was a modern, full-price game, and they were asking you to use these hideous ancient graphics, or some weird amalgam of modern and ancient. Tragically, this series cannot really be appreciated visually, as it looks even worse than what came before. Musically, the game is acceptable. It's just sort of generic kind of fantasy soundtrack. I don't have a lot to say about it. I don't really think it's very good. To be honest, though, in the expansion packs, there are a few songs that I do like, including one that I actually listened to just on its own without even playing the game, but that's really more well, because of the mystery of the moment in the game, not because it's really all that good, but it definitely, it does its job, it's serviceable. Putting aside the visuals for a moment, we're now going to get into the gameplay. Is the gameplay itself, which the original Neverwinter Nights excelled at, better or is it worse? Let's start with the good. Neverwinter Nights 2 is based on the updated 3.5 edition of D&D. 3.5, as the name implies, is not an entirely new system, but rather an attempt to fix some of the flaws in 3rd edition. To someone who's never played D&D, it will be largely invisible. It's a lateral move in my book, and rather unnecessary, all things considered. Changes of note include additional races, classes, and prestige classes to play as. All of this is welcome, but a lot of it was already in 3rd edition, not just in 3.5. As every new variation on yourself and your character makes the world and the gameplay richer and more fleshed out. You can play as half angels and half demons, half elementals, and eventually in later expansion packs, snake men and grey orcs. You can craft some really unique characters from that. Classes have been tweaked and altered a bit. Wizards' familiars are now little cats or birds, not the powerful monsters they were in the original. It's not terribly effective, as the combat-oriented video game is likely to leave little room for clever use of a familiar. It could have been something, but the simplest method of victory is attacking, so provides little function. Several new classes have been added, all of which really are variations on existing classes to some degree. The most unique of the bunch is the Warlock, which feels somewhat like a riff on the Sorcerer class. Sorcerers are a class based on wild talent for magical ability born from unusual parentage, rather than Hogwarts-style magical study. They have fewer overall spells, gaining only a paltry few per spell level, but they can cast the spells many times each instead of just once. The Warlock class takes this to an extreme, as they have even fewer spells to choose from, but can cast damage-based spells infinitely. This makes the class more than a little boring. It's just a repetitive casting of the same spell over and over. It tries to add something sinister or evil about the class, like summoning skeletons. It is a Warlock, after all. But that doesn't come across with the meager spell list provided. And it's virtually useless in combat because you will continually use elemental blasts over and over again. A missed opportunity to make a weird Diabolist evil wizard class. 2 of the other new classes are also, funnily enough, variations on the sorcerer, really. It's essentially a sorcerer version of the cleric and druid called the Favored Soul and Spirit Shaman. They both choose spells like the sorcerer. It makes both classes a bit overpowered because they can spam powerful spells over and over, but that's not that big a deal. Overall, character crafting is bigger and better, even without some easy additions like psionics like I would have liked that would have made me much happier. Now for the bad. The look and feel of the user interface is absolutely dreadful. Your health bar is too small and your character portrait is no longer a drawing, it's a rendering of your regular in-game head and thus hideous. Just moving the mouse or the camera is ungainly and slow. Whatever setting you may have it on, the camera looks terrible. The awful choppiness of every single moment of the game makes it uncomfortable just to look at the screen. The inventory system has taken a major hit as well. It's, like virtually everything visually in the game, ugly and difficult to look at. Neverwinter Nights 1 had a big open pack of things which you could open up and get a close-up view of various weapons and armor you had. The in-game appearance of those items was still bad, but at least in the inventory you can see a properly drawn rendition of it and see something cool. In 2, the items in the inventory are tiny, barely discernible, one-tile-sized blobs. They might as well just have text showing what they are. The terrible mouse movements, muddy design, and general low res of everything makes it impossible to manage the inventory effectively. Perhaps they were trying to make it easier than it was in Neverwinter Nights 1 by giving you more room to carry things, but I never ran out of room in the previous game, and this new system makes finding anything impossible because everything looks like everything else. Who thought this was a good idea? How am I supposed to distinguish anything? Once again, it's horrid. Inventory management is a major part of an RPG. You're going to be spending a whole mess of time picking up items, examining chests, and buying and selling things, all of which is a mess to look at. Even looting chests is unsatisfying because you just get a stock list of items with those same ugly sprites each time. It was far better in the first game. You actually felt like you were opening a chest and raiding it for items. Here you're bereft of that sense of pleasure, left alone in a world without wondrous treasure. Combat in Neverwinter Nights 2 is about the same as in 1. Aside from the terrible UI making everything work badly, it's a pause-and-play combat style that doesn't quite feel real-time or turn-based, but somewhere kind of in between, and neither of them really work right. Like the first game, 2 gives you the illusion that you can control the combat somehow, that you really have some kind of choice in the matter. But if you try to engage in it in an active way, it doesn't feel like an action game, because you're just clicking on something and then a die roll happens and you're sort of watching it happen. Making real tactical choices for your party is not that easy, as battles move pretty fast and you pretty much have to allow your NPCs to make their own decisions automatically or slow everything down drastically. Crucially, the game has changed the single worst decision of Neverwinter Nights 1. You can now control any one of the characters in your party at any time. This is an absolutely vital change that was crazy to leave out of the original. Now your wizard, who's a frail nerd with a stick, isn't the assault pioneer leading every charge into battle. You can switch him out if you want a sneaky rogue or brutish warrior who isn't going to die the second somebody sneezes on him. Unfortunately, NPCs seem to have a life of their own and wander off chasing distant enemies rather than following your lead. Quite a few enemies have triggered traps endlessly this way. This happens in my experience far more than it did in Neverwinter Nights 1 and makes battles much harder to control. The characters all just run pell-mell around the map doing what they like, tactics be damned. The combat style lacks both the kinetic sensation of an action RPG and the slow satisfaction of precision a tactical RPG provides. The combat in 1 was at least helped out by a simple UI that was easy to maneuver around, while this one is jerky and difficult. I know it doesn't seem like it's changed all that much between 1 and 2 in the overall, but it just feels so much worse in the second game that even though technically it's very much the same, I hate it. It's very easy to miss clicking on your intended target and click something else instead. That causes repeated frustration for me while playing. One excellent change is that the characters will now not die if reduced to 0 hit points. Instead, they get knocked unconscious and wake up if any surviving party members win the battle. This ends the fairly tedious process of resurrecting dead NPCs, which, even on easier difficulties, tended to happen all the time. It does make combat much simpler. Death now holds very little danger as long as one party member survives, but also makes combat so simple and so basic it eliminates the risk of losing that party member, and that can be trying for some people. All in all, this seems like a nice place to end the review. Ending it on a down note about this series failed to rekindle anything valuable about a short-lived D&D game remembered for being the last of the pre-3D era, when Dragon Age, Dark Souls, and Dragon's Dogma became the gold standard. But that's not the case. This is where the review takes a sudden and difficult turn. Everything I've said up to this point has been neutral or negative. Even the things that were good hardly qualify as worthy reasons to play the game today. And if the legacy of the game stopped with the original campaign, then Neverwinter Nights 2 would remain in history a rightfully neglected and forgotten game. Confusing the issue forever, though, is the release of the first expansion pack on October 9th, 2007. Mask of the Betrayer is not only a great expansion pack, it is, quite simply, one of the best stories I've ever played in a video game. No qualifications there. Quite simply, out of all the video games I've played, this is near the very top of the heap. Only Planescape Torment, Silent Hill 2, and Ultima 7 compete with it. If you haven't played Mask of the Betrayer, you're missing out on one of the very best games in history. Now keep in mind, all of my criticisms of the gameplay and visuals are still present. It's a somewhat ugly game with mediocre gameplay. Not all that fun to actually play, to actually engage with. However, Planescape Torment My pick for the best story in a game ever is also not a treat to actually play through. It's a clunky and difficult vehicle to drive, but where they'll take you is someplace very special. Mask of the Betrayer begins right where the original campaign ends, and it turns out you've been teleported away to a distant location at the last minute. You're actually thousands of miles away from Neverwinter in the obscure Forgotten Realms country of Rashomon. Rashomon has a very Skyrim-type feel to it. A distant land with berserkers, Scandinavian or Eastern European feel, pine trees, ice, and snow, and it's ruled by a weird matriarchy of witches. It's not ultimately that different from the medieval European setting, but it looks far better than the cheery green fields of Neverwinter. There's also a lot more visual novelty. You'll see the labs of the Red Wizards of Thay, celestial cities, the astral plane, and the eerie black and white fugue plane filled with undead and shadows draining the color from everything. Your character has become host to a bizarre and evil entity that drives you to devour souls. And if you try to avoid it, a terrible violent craving sets in that will make you insane before killing you. As you explore Rashomon and try to find a cure for your affliction, you explore themes of addiction, fortitude, despair, and nihilism, as you race against time to save your life and soul from annihilation by a remorseless force of the cosmos. That enough would be a fantastic game, but it actually goes deeper than that, so much deeper. The story actually gets better than that one as you learn the origins of the Soul Devourer, and you go on one of the most epic quests to shake the very foundations of heaven, challenge the gods. You learn so much about the cosmic history of everything in the multiverse, and defy the dark roots of deific power to seize your destiny. Who the hell thought this should be relegated to an expansion and that trash they passed off as a story be the main campaign? This is what we've gotten through with the era of expansion packs. That needs to stop. An essential part of the game, or an actually good game compared to the trash you had to give us before, that shouldn't be an expansion, that should be the main game! What the hell? I've played the original campaign a couple of times and was bored stiff every time. Mask of the Betrayer I played many times and always enjoy it. The story takes you all over the place, from icy lakes deep in the woods to subterranean labyrinths owned by cannibalistic witches to a dreamscape with dark hints about your disease. Twice now, the gem of the game was hidden in an expansion pack. One of the designers of Mask was actually Chris Avallone, who made Planescape Torment. Like that game, it's a bit of a slog to work through, but ultimately very rewarding for the story and characters. The world and NPCs of Mask of the Betrayer are brilliantly realized with a fascinating history and backstory. You'll recruit a rainbow-colored bear, a shadowy creature born of the massacre of priests of the god of death, an angelic woman on a mysterious crusade against heaven, among others. And I actually like talking to them and want to know more about them. It's actually interesting, unlike the original campaign. I want to spend time hearing what these characters have to say. They're all brilliantly written compatriots for your quest. There would be other expansions, but nothing quite like this. If you want to check out this game, make sure to play Mask of the Betrayer, because it is absolutely great, and you're doing yourself a disservice if you just think the original campaign is all this has to offer. That's a terrible distraction to this greatness. Play it whenever you can. It's absolutely fantastic. Storm of Zahir, the penultimate expansion pack for Neverwinter Nights 2, was released in North America on November 18th, 2008. The most exciting thing about Zahir was its radical change to the character creation process. Instead of making one main character and hiring pre-made NPCs, Zahir allows you to create a fully fleshed out party of 6 people. That was amazing, and something that never should have gone away, ever. Finally, Neverwinter Nights could return to the old-fashioned style of RPGs like Wizardry or Might and Magic. I absolutely adore making a full party to play as, intricately working out how best to tweak their roles, styles, faces, and cooking up a set of backstories to explain their personalities and why each one is there. When the devs pre-design NPCs, it seemed like a good thing for the game. It typically presented to players as, instead of ciphers with no backstory or personality, some highly professional writers were hired to give life to these lumps of clay. There are often varying degrees of smugness and condescension in that attitude. They assume they are good writers, and to be fair, sometimes they are, like the great writers of Planescape Torment or Mask of the Betrayer, and they assume they're better creators than the players themselves, and assume no one would like to have blank slates to build on. All of which is wrong. They may not be very good at character designs and give us crummy, dull characters like Sten. And most importantly, good or not, these writers are denying the players the chance to be part of the creative process by filling the roles of the PCs. They feel more in charge of a traditional writing structure. The players are the creators, and it's their responsibility to make the characters exciting and worthwhile. When this is done successfully, as it was in Planescape Torment, it seems worthwhile, because you get to hear about, talk to, and interact with well-drawn, fleshed-out people. When it's not done successfully, like in Dragon Age 1 and 2 and the base campaigns in Neverwinter Nights 1 and 2, the characters you meet are banal and bland or offensive and irritating. But even when it's done correctly, it still robs you of an important gameplay aspect. Far from being an aesthetic add-on, the internal role-playing of your character or characters is a major gameplay feature. The blankness of the characters is a template for you to build on. Robbing the player of that is not writing, it's poor design in an RPG. Ideally, gameplay and story should be blended perfectly together, but it should always be preferred in a video game to choose the gameplay involved in allowing players to make their own story, over writing in characters, personalities, and actions that would be part of a traditional medium. The gameplay has been altered somewhat to fit this new system. You still have a main character that you primarily control at the start. He can gain certain feats usable only in Zahir that allow playing with a party of 6 rather than 4 characters. You will also get into overworld-based random fights with enemies on occasion, far more than you did in Neverwinter Nights 2, the original. Other than that, the gameplay is essentially the same, except they've added new feats and spells like they did with Mask. The combat does not feel well designed, real-time as it always was, to work with a tactical role-playing experience of a 6-person party. BioWare would also somewhat fail with this in the first Dragon Age game. Nothing really recaptures the old Goldbox-style tactical aspects of the D&D game world. The setting of Zahir is the fascinating world of Kult. Kult is a tropical land in the far south of the Forgotten Realms. Strange reptilian creatures, including dinosaurs, roam the steaming jungles. Cities and cultures are remarkably different than the boring medieval Europe setting. It's sort of like you're in medieval Africa. However, much of that is mitigated by the awful visual style of the series. It's like what I already said, nothing can really look good no matter how hard you try. It's too washed out and soft. Despite that, I worked my imagination overtime trying to enjoy the sweltering jungle setting, but to no avail. You see, after about a half of the game or so, you leave the land of Kult. You leave this fascinating setting, and you spend the last part of the game dicking around in Neverwinter. What? Why? They have a tremendous advantage of playing in an ultra-cool new setting that I don't think, as far as I remember, has ever been in a video game before. I can't remember ever playing in Cult before this. And they just give up halfway and return to the area around the base game? Are you kidding? It's a bloody disaster and totally ruined any enjoyment I had for the setting. The rest of the campaign is boring and tedious, much like the original campaign, because you're just hanging around Neverwinter. The fact that it all comes crashing down as you return makes the rest of the game barely worth playing. The story is not terrible, but it's nothing to write home about after the incredible Mask of the Betrayer either. It's definitely a downturn. Neverwinter Nights 2 received another expansion pack called The Mysteries of Westgate. Westgate's story, I think, was better than the original campaign, but that's not saying much, and hardly worth playing compared to the greatness of Mask of the Betrayer. That game shines so brightly it makes the other ones look bad in comparison. Neverwinter Nights 2 also includes a powerful modding tool letting players make their own game worlds. Though I'm not a modder myself, I've heard it was more difficult to use than the original Neverwinter system, and the incredible lack of mods made it with it compared to the original is a testament to that. Though there is a Planescape series made called Dreamcatcher, I haven't played it yet, but it looks very well done. Still, there are fewer modders for 2 than the original, and it doesn't look like any more will be made, or many more will be made. The second game just didn't inspire as many people as the first. The reason I made these 2 videos is because I have conflicting feelings about the 2 Neverwinter Nights games. It's a series I have huge nostalgic feelings for. I played both games to death growing up, and I'm still fond of them despite their flaws. And those flaws are huge. Playing a bad game is easy. You try it, discard it, and forget it. But playing a game that's mostly built on good foundations with shaky follow-through is like the student who's smart and capable but doesn't apply themselves. You feel frustrated and upset, but willing to work with them to improve their lives. That's why I made these videos, so people don't make these obvious mistakes that I think were glaring from the beginning, and make better games in the future. D&D-based games were such a major part of my video gaming life that I hated to see them ignobly crash and burn around this time. It's not like the influence went away. As I mentioned in the first video game series, video games wouldn't exist in the form they do without D&D. The RPG series introduced video game standbys such as levels, classes, statistics, and more that are all common in games, RPG or no. There is so much in D&D I want there to be video games of to explore all of those marvelous worlds they've created, especially Planescape, but also Dark Sun and Ravenloft. I still think these worlds could be adapted successfully in modern games. Bloodborne proved that a Ravenloft game could become very popular. There's a tendency of some game reviewers to seem entitled or overly harsh, as if we're trying to find fault for its own sake, but that's not what I'm doing. I've been very harsh to the Neverwinter series in these reviews, but that's because of the love. The love I've had playing these games hundreds of hours over the past 15 years. The love of seeing something so promising and worthwhile being neglected, mishandled, and ultimately scarred when it should have been perfect. I want there to be a brand new D&D based game for everyone to enjoy. It's not like there haven't been any, but they haven't reached the level of this is the game that you have to play this year status that we see with others. And this time, in a new decade with new gaming lessons learned to avoid the failures of Neverwinter Nights. I still enjoy playing both the first and second games immensely and plan on making them a part of my gaming library for many years to come. Playing a game over 10 years after it came out is a testament to any game's power. But over the years I can't help but notice and comment on the ridiculous UI Neverwinter Nights 2 or the lack of proper companions in 1. I want these games to be much better than they are. I know the series was trying new things and a very new style that sloughed off a lot of the prior 2 decades of D&D gaming in favor of something new, and it didn't quite work. They made too many mistakes, partially due to technological and design limitations of the time. That leaves this series stuck in a middling swamp between 2 generations. One ultra-modern 3D games and the other more old-fashioned hex-based dungeon crawlers. But I still enjoy the semi-real-time gameplay and most of all the fantastic stories that everyday people were able to tell with the built-in editor they provided. Ultimately, the best the games produced tended to be from average people exploring their storytelling skills. And that's what you're supposed to do with D&D. A regular person learning to tell an amazing fantasy story with the tools they provided. And Neverwinter Nights is always going to be a great system for doing that. The community for the games is still active today, making and playing their own stories in their own words, using their own worlds. Neverwinter is just a great jumping off point for their stories. And ultimately, it's an excellent series. I was very harsh, but I really feel that people should play them. They're fantastic games for all their flaws, and they're really worthwhile and worth your time. So if you get a chance, check them out. Hey there, thanks so much for watching this. My name is Michael, and like this video if you liked it, and please subscribe if you want to see more content from me. I make videos about all kinds of subjects like Dungeons & Dragons, Planescape, Warhammer 40,000, Twin Peaks, and other things. I've linked 2 videos here that I've made about, one about Ravenloft and one about a series I did about Planescape, so check those out if you like Dungeons & Dragons. Thanks a lot, and thanks for watching.